So today I want to talk about the basics of color theory. Color theory seems like one of those things that's really big and really complicated, and don't get me wrong, it's a huge, deep topic. It's all about picking the right colors for something and making sure those colors fit together. And it's a really core foundation of art. In fact, when I was first learning to paint, all we did for the first couple weeks was just mix colors so we understood how they behaved. But really, color theory can be broken down to something much, much simpler. Is the color cool or is the color warm? We have this invisible dividing line between red and green that shows us the contrast between blue and orange. And this kind of creates this little cross for us that we have areas that feel cool and areas that feel warm. And so for us creating a balance is adding some warm and some cool that has enough on either side of this sort of wheel that keeps it in balance, that keeps it from tipping off. Because heading too far into one direction is going to upset the balance of our composition. And as I'm going to talk about in composition in a day or two, balance is really, really important. So there's a lot of different models, and you've probably heard of all of these, and I want to just touch on them a little bit and explain to you what the sort of theory behind it is. I'm going to turn on my little... Oh, they don't have the... oh, there it is, laser pointer. So first is monochromatic, which is something that exactly what it sounds like, something that's all blue, all one color. Mega Man is pretty monochromatic. It has shades and tints of only one color, which can actually be really good if you want to show a strong mood of a single color. For instance, if you want green to be a dominant color, everything in the scene should be green. We're really pushing this idea of green. We might show just shades of green. However, if we want to show contrast between two things, a character against a sky, an explosion in space, we want to highlight something specifically, you're better off with a complementary color scheme. I'd say complementary is probably the most common way that people do color schemes because it's maybe the easiest one to understand. Basically, it means you take this big color wheel and you pick opposite sides, because these colors contrast with each other the most. So purple to yellow, blue to orange, green to red. So, and in every other kind of direction, we see that the sort of more I get to warm, the more my cool color gets to warm, the more my warm color needs to get to cool to create the right contrast. So just like black and white shows us light and shadow, different colors show us contrast of form as well. Then we get into split complementary. It's the same thing, but instead what we do is we take our second complementary part and we just split it into two paths. So there's still a balance. These colors down here in the sort of split are probably going to be a little less saturated, a little less intense, a little closer to gray. And this one is going to be the more intense color. So it's like a more complicated version of complementary. And we can split it twice instead of just once and get double complementary. So it's like a four-way balance in it. Triadic, however, instead of having this sort of two-dimensional balance, is about trying to do a three-dimensional balance. You'll see triadic a lot most in sort of really stylized or cartoony stuff. So like Mario is triadic. A lot of the Nintendo designs for characters are actually triadic because they create this three-color balance. And then lastly, I want to talk about analogous. It's very similar to monochromatic, but it just pushes off to the left and right side of the wheel. So it's like a more complicated version of monochromatic. Remember when I talked about that green forest? Maybe I want to do this green forest, but I push some bright spots of yellow into it and some deeper greens into the forest. So I can keep it all one color mostly, but the further I split it out, the more rich and complicated the overall visual looks. So when choosing these colors, it's not just about the raw color, it's also about our hue, our saturation, and our value. So this is the model we're talking about, hue, saturation, and value. Now, you might be used to this guy up here. This is red, yellow, and blue, and it's the way paint works if you ever mix paint and pigment. As a kid, you know the more and more paint you mix, the closer to a very dark color it gets. This is because paint and pigment is additive. The more pigment we add to something, the darker it gets. Because what we're dealing with in computer graphics is light, we work with red, blue, and green. Because the more we add to this, it's additive, it adds up to white. So we start in pigment, usually on white, and we add to get darker, and it's the exact opposite inside of computer graphics because we're simulating the properties of light. We start with zero, with dark, with nothingness, and we add more and more color to it until we get pure white light. And the model we use, though, however, to choose these colors is called the hue, saturation, value model. because it's an easier way of breaking it down. The hue is what you think about as color. It's green, it's yellow, it's blue. We can think of this as the chroma is sometimes also what it's called, and it's this sort of outside of this circle diagram. The value is something else you might think about, how light or dark the actual color is. So its value going from black up to its whitest point. And then lastly, we have saturation. How intense is the color? Very desaturated at the center of this model and more saturated to the outside. And in my opinion, saturation is actually the most important because saturation says how big, how important, how vibrant is this color. So this is not a model we use. This is the model we use. So this is a good example of some art from, I think this is Dota 2, and they did a really good job of showing how they broke down their color combinations. And you could see when we actually see the colors picked out, they're very muted in most of the spots, and they're not nearly as saturated as it seems. So in these cases, even these really intense characters start with these very intense palettes, and you see the actual final characters, they really mute them down and make them much, much simpler because we're working with these things together. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes I see beginning students use when they use color is they want to go super intense with the brightest colors possible right away, but it's too much and it's too much contrast. I like to think about this in terms of, they use this in interior decoration. It's called the 60-30-10 rule. 60% of your color should be your primary color. About 30% can be your secondary, which can be split between two, like in this example. And then 10% is your accent color. And that's usually like your biggest, intense, most picked out color. So for these example, this guy's sort of mainly this blue color. And then maybe the secondary color is these brown kind of details. And then they use yellow to just pick out some interesting areas. A place you can go to check out, there's a really great website called coolors.co, which is really helpful for helping you pick out complementary and matching colors. There's also Adobe Color, which is a really cool tool to check out as well. But what I want to do is a quick analysis of, I think, a really nice character piece, and I want to talk about why I think these colors work really well. So let's just pick a couple things out, and I'm going to switch to my paintbrush, and I'm just going to pick out, starting with this major basic green. Oops, let's undo that. Which is probably the biggest color here. And you can see this green is not a very intense green. Look on the spectrum of how muted this actually is. When I compare it to a very intense green, wow, that's a lot different. Now, kind of going in, let's look at the next major color, which is her hair. And we put next to it, and we can see we're getting green and red contrast. It's using a green-red sort of complementary contrast method. And now let's look at these other areas, all of the other supporting areas, the whites, the golds, the browns. I want to show you what happens when I start putting them next to each other. Suddenly this gold doesn't look nearly as gold, and we can see that these three colors are basically the same color, just in different values and saturations, because it helps blend these things together. And in fact, you can see down here a little bit of red-green contrast as well. But look at how much more subtle this red, like how much more desaturated this red-green is, because we want to draw all of the attention. The highest saturation is all up here to draw our attention to the character's face, which is where the most interesting stuff is happening. Draw our attention away from the other areas. Now, of course, we still have some yellow in here because it's creating an interesting light that it's lighting up things, and we reuse that yellow kind of a tone in a couple other places here as well. So this feels more complicated than it is, but really it's just basically saying, hey, let's take green and let's take red and let's mute them a little bit and let's create some gradation of some brown grays to help mute out and fill out the rest of the character into our secondary kind of colors. So this is another good tip for any of you who are trying to figure out why are these colors look good. Pop them into a paint program, start using the eyedropper and see what color things really are when they're separated from the character piece. Because I bet when you click on this looks a lot more muted than you think it is, because again, in contrast, it looks so much more intense. All right, we'll see you in the next one.